You may know that on my main channel, Big Deuce, I made a video talking about just like the general history and design of the video game cartridge. What you probably don't know, or shouldn't know, is this is a mild remake of a video I made a couple years ago on an older channel that no longer exists. I figured I should, or at least it would be neat, to make that video available somewhere, so I'm gonna put it up here. Everything that follows after this little spiel is just going to be it in its uncompromised state, and if you're just stumbling upon this, you can find the better and less garbage version of the video in the description of this upload. Without further ado, here's the original version of the game cartridges video.
A lot of people say that Mario 64 is one of the best games of all time. It revolutionized 3D gaming as we know it, and it's strange that I've never played it since I owned the cartridge, so alright, I'll finally play it. Yes, the video game cartridge, the vessel carrying the next 4 hours of your life unless you own a PlayStation or Xbox. These plastic containers were essential to video games for the longest time, starting all the way back in 1972 when Magnavox was creating the first console. Somebody working on it realized, wait, they didn't come with the games baked in? So they had to make another plastic tech square to put the game inside, and that's how we got here. Saying cartridge designs don't matter doesn't make a lot of sense. There's a lot of time and effort put into making these look like they're a part of the brand. And like, imagine if every Mario 64 copy looked like this. This is how my copy looks. Yes, I'm ashamed of it. Yes, I have nightmares about it. The Odyssey carts are nothing to write home about. Just a rounded rectangle with a number and the strips hanging out. Things didn't start getting crazy until the Atari 2600, if your definition of crazy is extremely mundane. The cartridges were actually quite varied. Most Atari published games used the same format that they would use on the boxes at the same time, and were pretty much just cereal box shaped. But then, things changed with the NES. Nintendo decided to innovate in the video game industry by actually caring about the cartridges. First off, this column of grooves adds a ton of style and is great functionally as well. This little gap at the end of the cartridge was placed at the end so that you could remove the cartridge from the system. As for the art, it's just the box art. No flair, no nothing. It was pretty much just the same thing with the Game Boy cartridges, minus the grooves. However, with the Super Nintendo, they changed that, with the art being surrounded by this design resembling the box. Weirdly enough, the shape of the cartridge resembles the Odyssey, with the rounded rectangle. Except for the Super Game Boy attachments, they sort of looked like the Japanese cartridges with a slot for the Game Boy cartridges. That's the thing! The design of the cartridges can be different depending on what region you're in. The NES's Japanese equivalent, the Famicom, went the Atari route by making them a brick. As for the Super Famicom cards, they just smoothed every possible area of the American cartridges, but after that, the cartridges became uniform between regions. The Nintendo 64's cartridges continued the trend of making smooth round cards, with an extremely rounded top. However, with the art on the cartridge, they decided to switch it up. Again, the cartridge art was back to being up in the air. Sometimes it would be the same as the box art, sometimes it would be new art for the cartridge, and sometimes it would just be the game's logo. Meanwhile, the Game Boy Color was doing something different with its cards. It sure was. But then, it happened. Discs could just hold so much more data than cartridges could, and were much cheaper to produce. On top of that, it turned other consoles into full-on music players and DVD players. Meanwhile, the N64 was underpowered and could only play 64 games. This is why Nintendo lost to PlayStation during the 5th console generation, as the N64 just wasn't up to snuff with the PlayStation and Saturn. But at least people weren't pirating their games and they had faster load times. I'm sure that will give them the edge. However, even though the GameCube had decided to go with discs, the cartridge legacy was carried over to the Game Boy Advance. They basically just cut a Game Boy card in half, made it darker gray, and added a notch on the top. Pretty simple. The DS opted for a slimmer cartridge that was Cheez-It shaped, and usually just had a smaller version of the box art on the cart. As for the 3DS, yeah, that's just a DS cart with a peg. And that brings us to now with the Nintendo Switch. What do you want me to say? It's another slim rectangle. though this time almost all the carts have the game logo on it with the ESRB rating in the corner. Sometimes it looks good, and sometimes it's Pokemon Sword and Shield. And that brings us to... I forgot to talk about the other companies. Okay, quickly, Sega Master System. Just some rectangles with labels, nothing to write home about, just like the Master System as a whole. As for the Genesis, I'm much more of a fan of these. At the end of the day, it's just another rounded rectangle with box art on it, but I like it a lot more than the Master System ones. Is it because I own a Genesis? Yeah, but I also think it's because the Genesis's vibe is much cooler than the Master System's. One of these feels like a thrill ride, while the other just feels like my algebra homework. Oh, and the Game Gear cards were just mini Genesis cards. And then finally, we get to the PS Vita. These are just Switch cartridges. And that brings us to today, where only one company uses cartridges. Discs are just the way to go, being able to store just so much more data. At the end of the day, the design of a cartridge doesn't matter that much once you have it in your system, but there's certainly a level of effort that goes into the design of a cartridge. Plus, you have to admit, this is just so much better than this. Thrilling.